All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Tuesday, January the 19th. Yep. Hope everyone had a good day yesterday and everybody sleep well. Yeah. I'll say good morning to some people. Michelle is here. Good morning, Michelle. Adon is here. Good morning to you, sir. Hadil is here. Hello, Hadil. Ivan is here. Good morning, Ivan. And Amanpreet is here. Good morning, Amanpreet. So, yesterday what we were talking about, we were talking about prehistory, right? So we were talking, and Adil's here as well. Good morning, Adil. We were talking about kind of the beginnings of human culture. And again, we're kind of going way, way back here, and so we probably shouldn't spend too much time talking about this, although I would like to because I think it's cool and interesting. In fact, at university, I took a full course on hominid evolution. It was like a full term, and this is all we talked about is this stuff, and it was really interesting. But we were looking at, sorry, I'm just going to jump ahead a couple slides here. We were looking at our family tree, right, and how we kind of evolved into the creatures that we have. And I mentioned here that there were, in fact, quite a number of species that were running around over the past few million years, and there's probably an almost 100% chance that we actually don't know, that we haven't identified all of the species that existed during that time. We've identified, maybe 20 or so, 20 or 22 different hominid species that lived in the past, but undoubtedly there are more that we haven't discovered yet. The fossil record is incomplete, it's not perfect, it's very difficult to kind of assemble and interpret, and so this is one version of what may have happened. And so some of these creatures are probably ancestral to us, and some of them are not, right? But again, they're all part of our kind of evolutionary story. And so we said the first kind of hominids, the first kind of apes to stand on 2 feet might have looked something like this. And, very much an ape standing on 2 feet, right? No? What's no? They're not your ancestors? Why not?
I don't believe we were apes. We have been created well, first of all, I don't like to be called an ape.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like my great-fathers to be called an apes.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think we will, as they say, we have been in evolution. So from apes to humans, then what we are gonna be?
Yeah. Nobody knows. But it is important to, actually, you've brought up a good point here, is that, the story I'm telling you here is is a science story, right? It's an anthropology story. And what we'll see as we kind of proceed through this course is that cultures have different ideas and beliefs and values about things. And one of the things that they have different ideas about is what people are, right? What is it to be a human? Where do human beings come from? Where are they going? What is the nature of the universe, right? Those are all cultural beliefs that differ from culture to culture and from time to time. And so, the story I'm providing you here is the science story, right? It's not the religion story, it's not a mythological story, it's the science one. And so, yeah, I'm not necessarily trying to convince you of this, I'm just providing you with, this is what science believes to be true.
Yeah, I know that. But also the science, we have been getting taught this is our ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
But also science itself, it says it's only a theory. But why are we getting the way we are getting taught?
Mm-hmm.
Nothing about you.
Yeah. Like in general, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay.
They are almost this is our ancestors. You can't debate.
You can always debate it, right? And that's, I'm not sure how much time we have to deal with it, but science is something that is, yeah, it's tough, especially in a time period and like a social context where science is being challenged and basic facts are being challenged. And so, one thing that we should remember about science is that it's always open to modification, right? It's constantly being challenged, and that's what science is really about, is challenging the evidence you have and making sure that the interpretations that you've made based on that evidence are solid, right? And so in theory, science is a process of continually challenging our ideas and seeing if they hold up, right? If we haven't talked about critical thinking yet, but we have in previous classes. And that's one of the things that we want when we critically think, is that we ask ourselves and we ask other people, why should I believe this thing, right? What is the evidence for what you are saying to me, right? And so that's constantly something that people should be asking of science and scientists, is what evidence do you have that supports this interpretation? Why should I, good morning, why should I believe the thing that you want me to believe? So, I definitely hear what you're saying, because because recently people have been so rejecting of just basic fact, right? And sort of the stereotypical example is, when President Trump claimed he had the biggest inauguration, or he had a bigger inauguration crowd than Obama. You remember that? And like, you looked at the aerial photos taken from the exact same place on Obama's inauguration and Trump's, and you can very clearly see there's a lot more people at Obama's than at Trump's. Like, it's obvious, right? It's obvious to people with eyes that this is the case, but people have been challenging basic facts. And so it's difficult because people have gone so far over that way, people are trying to push hard the other way. And so, yeah, science is something that should be believed, but it should also be questioned as well, right? And it's good to question it, right? It's good to say, have we made the right interpretation here? Do we have all the evidence? Does the evidence say what we think it says? Or have we misinterpreted? Or are we missing something? Was the experiment flawed in some way? Is the data set too small, right? We should always be questioning. And that's what scientists' jobs actually are, is not only to discover things, but to question their colleagues and say, hey, have you done your due diligence here? Have you done your science correctly, right? And so that's what scientists argue about all day long, is, whether what they think they know is actually what they know. And so, I understand what you're saying, I think, and the context that we're in now, but yeah, science is something that should be and is constantly challenged. And people should be open to changing their minds based on good science.
Yeah, and also like, since Darwin that talked about that we were apes before like we became human,
Mm-hmm.
they took it and affirmed it, even though like Darwin like he rejected or say, oh, I like take out my words, I was wrong. They never mention it, and also they never mention like other creatures than apes that have been developing. They show it as like, oh, we are like chimpanzees because they are the closest DNA and like molecules like us.
Yep.
Why didn't they show us sheeps,
Mm.
cows, other mammals, dolphins? Why? And also they said, oh, we came from water. Who's our ancestors? Show us like one example of it.
Sorry, who's ancestor? Wait, can you say that again?
Also, like we have been taught that we came from water. We were
Oh,
like from the beginning,
way
way,
back.
way back.
Yeah.
Very small, tiny hydrogen molecule became into like this big universe.
Yeah.
Like how it came, from where,
Yeah.
how.
And
if the base is weak, how you gonna build onto it?
well, and that's the other piece of science too, is that you can, and maybe with respect to this, I'll use this as an example, is that you can really only work with the data that you have, right? And so here, let's say paleoanthropologists have tried to create a bit of a family tree, right? A story of where we come from in terms of bipedal primates. And do we have the whole picture? Absolutely we don't, right? There is 5 million years of history, most of which takes place on the African continent. But we don't have access to fossil records in every place in Africa, right? We don't have time to get into this, but often paleoanthropologists and paleontologists will dig in a place where the ground, where they can access the time slice that they want to, that's simple, right? So I think we all know, like if you dig down in the ground, you kind of go back in time, right? The deeper you go, the earlier you go. We kind of understand that, right? Yeah. So if you want to go back, let's say 4 million years, how deep do you think you're going to have to dig? It's a long way down. Yeah, it's a long way down. So paleoanthropologists and paleontologists tend to dig in places where that 4 million year old layer is actually close to the surface, right? So erosion or rivers and glaciers have cleared away the land and exposed that layer, so it's easier to get to. So we don't have data from all of Africa. We don't have all of the fossil record. We probably don't have every species that existed. And so, yeah, it's a continual effort to find new pieces and try to figure out where they fit into the puzzle. And this is a sort of an area of anthropology that is kind of constantly rewritten. And so anthropologists used to think that our species was 200,000 years old. That's when Homo sapiens appear, around 200,000 years. But even just in the past 4 years or so, there have been archaeological finds and genetic studies that have shown that actually our species is probably maybe 100 to 150,000 years older than that. And so, again, that evidence kind of rewrites the story a little bit. And so it's kind of a constant process of trying to uncover new information, trying to make sure that that information is legitimate and valid, and then trying to figure out where it fits in the puzzle. And it's a difficult puzzle to put together because we actually don't know the story, right? So imagine doing a puzzle, like you would do at home with, it's a landscape or something like that, and you're putting the pieces together. Paleoanthropologists are doing the same thing, but they don't have the box top, right? They don't know what the picture is that they're supposed to be building. And so it's a very difficult process of slowly, painstakingly putting these pieces together to tell a story. And it's not a complete story. And nobody in the field would say that it is, because there's just a lot of things we still don't know.
Yeah, you said they said that we humans, we go back 4,000 years ago.
The current estimates are around 300,000 years ago.
Because that won't make sense, because my city only, now they are finding things, they found things that go back 9,000 years ago.
Yeah.
And now they're finding 11,000 years ago, so that won't make sense.
Yeah, I think it's Damascus that has the title of the longest continuously inhabited city on the planet, I think, right?
But Aleppo is the oldest.
Where is?
Aleppo.
Aleppo?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the oldest, but Damascus is inhabited.
Yeah.
Where there are population.
It's true, yeah. People have been living there continuously for, thousands of years, like 10 or 11,000 years. And probably even before that, but at a time when, people didn't really live in towns or villages or anything. But I think I almost know for a fact that there's evidence of human behavior in that area that predates that even. So yeah, humans have a long history in that living and existing in that part of the world, right? It's an important part of the world for a lot of for anthropological reasons. But yeah, we should listen, but we should also be open to other interpretations when good information comes along, because that's what good scientists do, right? They make the best interpretations they can, and when someone comes along with good evidence and good interpretations, good scientists should be able to say, yep, that's right, we were wrong about that other thing, we thought it was that, but this evidence shows us that that's not the way it is, it's actually this way. And so science is that, right? It's a constantly evolving field of knowledge, and yeah, we should be open to other information if it's good, right? If it's solid, legitimate information.
But
Huh?
when is that gonna happen?
When? One never knows.
Yeah, because like the same topic. Whenever somebody thinks of science, he said, like, let's say I will study science.
Mm-hmm.
First, thing I will say, if somebody asks me, okay, I study science. Oh, you study about the Big Bang theory, humans, evolution, apes, we were monkeys. Why science is not only this? Why are we only getting teach that?
I don't know. Science is it's a big field, right? I don't know why you've kind of bumped into that more often. Here it makes sense because we're talking about humans and human culture. I won't talk about the Big Bang Theory, I promise. But yeah, I don't know. They're just, there's some really big questions that we continue not to have the answers to. And science has allowed us to figure out a lot of things and build and engineer and design a lot of things, but there's still some big questions that we haven't answered yet, right? And who knows, maybe we'll never be able to answer them, but maybe that's why I don't know. Yeah. Okay, can I keep going? Is that okay? If you have other stuff, you can definitely throw it in, but I just don't want to get too far behind. But yeah, let me know. Okay, right, so science and paleoanthropologists tell us that kind of the first walking primates looked like this, right? And again, they're very apey looking. They've got really long arms, long fingers, which is evidence of their living and moving around in the trees, but also something that's able to walk around on 2 feet. And we're not entirely sure why these things were walking on 2 feet in the forest, but usually with evolution, it's kind of a use it or lose it scenario. And so if an adaptation appears, if it's not beneficial to that organism's survival, it tends to disappear. And actually one good example of that is actually our sense of smell. Humans didn't really need their sense of smell. We rely much more on our eyes for taking in information about the world. And so as a result, a lot of the genes that have to do with interpreting smells have actually been shut off in humans. So that's why, as compared to, say, dogs, we have a really bad sense of smell. And because, again, we don't need it, right? We don't understand the world through our nose, right? We don't interpret the world through our nose the way that dogs do. We're visual creatures, right? So much more of our brain is dedicated to interpreting visual information. And so the scent genes, the smell genes, they've all been shut off, right? Whereas in dogs, they have a larger part of their brain that's focused on interpreting smells, because that's how they interact with the world, right? Through smells. So we mentioned a few. I showed you this kind of evidence at Laetoli, these footprints that are made by hominids about 3 million years ago, kind of fossilized in the ash. I said there were a bunch of different species, which we probably don't have time to deal with. These are a little bit artistic, but they're fun to look at. Looking at a skull is it's hard to get a picture of what the animal looked like, but it's interesting to think that things that might have looked like this were running around millions of years ago, right? I mentioned Homo habilis here, which is the first of our genus Homo, and I said that this was an important This was an important hominid because of their use of tools, right? And we said this was a very simple tool, but it was important for a number of reasons. What was one reason why this tool was important?
They are sharp.
They are
Sharp.
they are sharp, right? And so what can you do with a sharp tool such as this?
Break its shell.
You can break open animal skulls and eat the brains, which of course is disgusting for for most of us, or at least for me anyway. Of course, that's a cultural thing too, right? Which foods are Yeah, well, that's the thing, right? What foods should be eaten and shouldn't be eaten. Here in the West, we're not really that much into brains or organ meat, but other cultures, very much so, right? And so, some cultures, eating insects is an entirely acceptable thing to do, and they're a good sustainable source of protein. Here in the West, not so much, right? We don't really eat insects. We think that's kind of gross for the most part. So these Homo habilis guys were probably cracking open the skulls of animals that were killed by larger carnivores, right? And this would have been a huge advantage to Homo habilis. It has access to a food source that nobody else has access to. And it probably helped them to survive, because you need food to survive, but also might have helped to build their brains as well, because there's lots of omega-3s. And if you want to make sure your brain is well supplied with the fatty acids that it needs to function, then you should eat foods with omega-3s. Do you know what kind of foods have omega-3s in them?
Fish.
Yeah, so wild, not so much farmed fish, but wild fish like wild salmon will have good omega-3 quantities. What else? Yeah, well, brain tissue and some other organ meats will have high omega-3 contents. That's true. What else?
Fish oil.
Fish oil, yeah, which comes from the fish, right? So if people want more omega-3s, they eat those little fish oil capsules. Eggs are good too. Sometimes if you have chickens that are eating not like chicken feed, but if they're eating insects and things in the wild, their eggs will have higher omega-3 content. But anyway, this might have been good for this creature's brain, right? But I said even more important, what we should pay attention to is that they were making this tool, they were making this same tool for 1 million years, right? So this animal was passing down this knowledge and this technology, right? Parents were teaching their kids how to make this tool, right? And probably doing it with no language. These creatures probably didn't speak a language, at least not one that we're familiar with. And so they were able to teach their children and pass this behavior down, which I said was kind of the very seed of what culture is, right? Patterned behaviors and knowledge that we transmit from generation to generation. And again, our culture is infinitely more complex than anything that was going on 3 million years ago, but this is the very start of it, right? And so, yeah, it's interesting to think of these, these hominids running around Africa, surviving, right, with just, their own sort of cooperation and their very simple tool, and, somehow they survived, right? Not a likely creature to survive, but one that survived and thrived nonetheless. So we said our bipedalism, our ability to walk on 2 feet was important. Our brains and their structure and the way our brains develop, that's an important part of what humans are, and that's a whole story that we don't have time to get into, very sadly. Humans evolved a strong attachment system. So human babies are wired to attach to their caregivers, right? To their parents or who's ever taking care of them. Babies are wired to attach to them. That's part of who we are, and it's important. And I said we would get to this economic system thing just a little bit later. I asked you to read this section of the textbook, and do I have answers to that? Yes, I do. So we said that hominids, we don't know for sure why animals started walking on 2 feet like this. The only thing we know is that, again, it must have had some sort of advantage. Because again, that's really the only reason that adaptations stick around, right? If an animal develops something and it's not useful, that trait tends to disappear, right? The other thing that's disappeared, by the way, are tails, right? Nobody has a tail, I don't think, in this room, because humans don't need them, right? And so we have lost that adaptation, right? But our primate relatives who live in the trees and jump around like monkeys, their tails are very important, right? And so they continue to have them. And so again, evolutionarily speaking, creatures tend to lose adaptations that are not important or that don't help them survive. So we don't know why these creatures were walking on 2 feet. It seems that they were living in the forest. Maybe what's that?
Maybe they were crossing a long river.
Yeah, maybe climate change had something to do with it. Maybe the ability to travel long distances may have had something to do with it. But either way, those creatures were successful, right? That adaptation of walking on 2 feet was important, right? It helped these animals survive. And so it stuck around and it got passed down to us. We said another important thing was that climate change probably helped humans migrate and sort of settle the entire world, right? And so our ancestors would have been following plant and animal communities, right? Because that's what they need to eat. And so places getting warmer or getting colder, or animal populations increasing or decreasing, or animals migrating out of a certain area would have influenced where our ancestors moved as well, right? And so those climate changes kind of pushed them and pulled them to settle different areas. And of course, the glaciers melting in Alaska and northeast Russia would have allowed people to move into the New World, right? Which they did around 12,000 or 13,000 years ago. We've actually been able to confirm some of these things by looking at, geneticists have been able to do it, looking at mitochondrial DNA. Do you know what a mitochondria is? The powerhouse of the cell, right? That's what every biology class teaches us. Mitochondria are really interesting beyond the fact that they're the powerhouse of the cell, because once upon a time, and Baha, you're talking about way back, mitochondria were probably their own creature. They were probably a different organism because they have their own DNA. So mitochondria have DNA that are separate from yours. They're not the same. And so I think the idea is that once upon a time, these mitochondria creatures, and there were these unicellular creatures, and they decided to sort of form a partnership. So the mitochondria would live inside the cell and they'd be protected, and the cell would be benefited because the mitochondria metabolizes energy. And so now they're part of cells as we know them, but once upon a time they were actually 2 things. But anyway, the mitochondria have DNA all of their own, and those DNA mutate at a very predictable rate. And so if you compare different populations of people and you count back mutations, you can tell when a certain group of people separated and diverged from each other. And so based on this, geneticists have been able to create some sort of time frame for when humans migrated out of Africa and started spreading around the world. And of course, this is supported and sometimes contradicted by archaeological evidence as well. But we have a bit of a picture of how humans, evolved in Africa, eventually left Africa, although some stayed, and continued to sort of spread out through the entire world. Oh yeah, so here's my graphic of Beringia with the low sea levels when people were able to move across. And so you can see what it looks like now in the dark brown. Of course, you can't walk from Alaska to Russia, but thousands of years ago, you could, right? Those 2 pieces of land were connected and you could just walk across. Oh yeah. The other human, maybe not so much ancestor, but hominid species I'll point out are Neanderthals. And I'll point them out for a couple of reasons. One, because they were the last other human species to share the planet with us, okay? So they've only been gone for about 40,000 years, which is a long time in terms of our lifespan. But in terms of evolution and sort of 5,000 or 5 million year time spans, it's nothing, right? They just left, like we just missed them. And they're kind of interesting because, you know, we've mentioned that, oh, chimpanzees are pretty close to us. They've got 98% of our DNA kind of thing. These guys have like 99.8 or something. They're almost identical to us, but the differences are notable, right? And so Neanderthals are another human species, but they were built a lot differently than we are. And so we're kind of built in a very kind of lightweight, slim manner. So our bones and our muscle attachments and our muscles, we're not a particularly big or bulky species. Of course, some of us are a little bulkier than others, and if you spend time in the gym like Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, then you can get pretty big, right? But Neanderthals were kind of like that genetically. So their bones were bigger, they were kind of built bigger and stockier. You can see they've got a bigger head and a bigger face. They're just a more thick, rugged version of humans. And so you can see here a Homo Sapiens skull and a Neanderthal skull. You can see quite a bit of difference, right? They're not the same. And again, if a Neanderthal walked by you here on Terminal Avenue, well, you know, provided you weren't like looking at your phone or something, you would notice that there's, you know, he would be a human, or he would be a human, but you would notice something very strange about them, right? They don't quite look quote unquote normal, right? There's something just a little different about this kind of creature, right? And so you can see they've got a really big face, right? Big nose, big jaw. They don't have much of a forehead. Most of us humans have a flat forehead, like our forehead goes straight up and then it kind of curves back. But you can see these guys have a big ridge over their eyes, and then their skull kind of goes right back. They don't have much of a forehead. Baseball caps wouldn't fit very well on their heads. They're a different species, right? But you know, again, I invite you to think of a time 40,000 or 50,000 years ago when there were other humans on the planet. And again, they were quite similar to us in a lot of ways, but also they could have been quite different as well. We don't really know what they were like in that way, right? We don't really know how they behaved. We know they did a lot of hunting. We know that they made tools that were very sophisticated, not quite as sophisticated as ours, but sophisticated. There seems to be some gender division of labor. So the women Neanderthals had some chores to do, and the men Neanderthals had other ones to do. But we don't really know quite what they were like. But genetically speaking, they were very similar to us. They're the closest thing to us that has ever been that is not us.
Some people still have like Neanderthal genes, right? Because Neanderthals and Homo sapiens mated, and some people that still have their genes.
Yes, and so they have been able to sequence the Neanderthal genome, and so we do have a genetic sequence from Neanderthals, and yeah, there are genes that we share, that they've been able to identify. And you know, that I don't know how much you believe in the accuracy, but companies like 23andMe that do those genetic tests, you know, you spit in a tube and you send it to them and they sequence your DNA. I was kind of curious, so I actually did it. And yeah, I have a couple of hundred genes that are Neanderthal genes, interestingly enough. So, you know, in a way, I have a relation to creatures like this, as do a lot of Northern Europeans, because that's where Neanderthals tended to live, in kind of Central and Northern Europe. And so those genes have kind of been passed down. And so, yeah, they exist in modern populations. And according to 23andMe, they exist in here. Like you're looking at a Neanderthal descendant in a way, which is weird, right? So the third question I asked you yesterday is why did Homo sapiens expand and leave Africa? And again, we're not quite sure, right? It could have to do with maybe there's too many people, maybe the populations were getting too high and they needed some space of their own. Could be climate changes, it could be animals or plant communities moving based on climate change. We're not entirely sure, but we do know that they left, and we do have a reasonably good idea of when that started to happen. One of the other things I'll tell you here is it's important to maybe note that prior to about 70,000 years ago, the Homo sapiens that existed were very similar to us, but there was just kind of one thing missing. And the evidence of that change appears about 70,000 years ago. And what we start to see in the archaeological record is much more complexity, okay, in terms of the things that humans make. And so one of the first things to show up is this. And it's what would you say this is? Yeah, there's some sort of mythical made-up creature, right? So maybe it kind of looks a bit like a bear, maybe it's a lion. The body might be a bear with dog's feet, might be a human body with a lion head. It's not quite clear what it is, but it's not a real animal, right? It's some sort of made-up thing. But this is a big deal because in the archaeological record, this is the first evidence we have of humans making something that is imaginary, right? So this thing does not exist, right? And never existed. There's never been a lion man or anything like that. It's imaginary. And second, it's a piece of art, right? This is something that humans manufactured that has no practical purpose, right? It's not a tool, right? It's not a knife or something like that or a spear. It's something that's made for another purpose. What kind of why would somebody make something like this, do you think? What would be the purpose of it?
Fictional story.
What's that?
Fictional story.
Okay, maybe it's a part of a fictional story, like a myth or something. What else might be the purpose of this creation?
Toys.
Yeah, it could be a child's toy. What else could this be?
Scare children.
A what?
To scare children.
To scare children? Okay, it might be.
Poke children.
Might be, yeah.
Cultural symbol.
Okay, it might be a symbol of the people or the family or the group. What else could it be?
An artist's self-expression.
Sure, it could just be art for art's sake, right? It could just be artistic expression. Somebody liked to carve this creature. What else could it be?
Just somebody wants to make something new.
Yeah, it could just be somebody making something for the joy of it.
Done by mistake, was doing something else that appeared to be like this.
Maybe. Could it be religious?
Yeah.
Yeah, who knows? Maybe this was their god. We don't know. Anything is possible, right? We do not know the function of this thing. But what we do know is, again, that it's an imaginary creature. It's not a real creature. And it's something that has no obvious purpose. It's not a tool, right? And this is kind of the first appearance of art, right? Of artwork in...
Maybe you saw it in a forest, for example.
Maybe, but they probably didn't see a lion man, right?
Maybe it's just a bear standing up there.
Yeah, I was about to say that.
Could be. It very much could be.
Because they have similar ears.
However, it's true, we don't really know what it is. However, we also start seeing things like this. And so we start to see paintings in caves. And so again, evidence of artwork. And so it might be hard to see here, but you can see on the walls of this cave, there's all these scenes of animals and of hunting. And so there's these very early There's these oryx that are a very early version of a cow. There's wild horses. Sometimes you see rhinoceroses and pigs painted on the walls. All kinds of different things. What's that?
I just seen an eagle ship shooting flames.
Maybe.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, this looks like an eagle going down the side, shooting flames. I don't know.
Shooting flames? Where am I looking here?
Yeah, this is the head of him, and it's going down. Yeah. Then the white things are like his wings or something. Yeah.
Oh, okay, I see it. I see it. That's not what it is. That's not what it is. But I see from the angle, I see how it looks that way. That's cool. But yeah, there's lots of these kind of things, right? So you can see an oryx here, like a cow. There's kind of a horse that's painted on. In some cases, they've done something really interesting where, they mixed up some paint, right? Some paint with some pigment, and they kind of put it in their mouths, and then they put their hands on the wall and they spit all over it. So when they took it away, you can actually see their handprint on the wall. They've left their handprints there, and they're tens of thousands of years old. So you start to see artwork like this show up. You start to see really sophisticated tools. These are stone tools made by humans, and you can see from the scale, they're tiny little stone blades. These are really tough to make. And what you would do is you would take these little blades and you would carve a knife, like a shape of a knife out of bone or wood, and then you would stick the blades where the blade of the knife should go. You'd glue them in with hide glue, and then you'd have a really sharp knife. These are really difficult to make. You can't break a rock like this. People who study stone tools and stone tool technology, there's a very predictable way in which tools are made, and if you know what you're looking for, you can distinguish between a stone tool and just a broken rock. And so I took a stone tools class at university too, and in one class we actually tried to make stone tools. Hominid ancestors would have laughed at me. Like I spent like an hour, with like the gloves and the goggles, because the stone is like ridiculously sharp. And I spent an hour and I got something that was about this big, and it was almost a triangle, sort of. I don't think you could use it for anything. It was, what's that?
You use it for an arrow.
It was, no, I couldn't have used it for anything. They know how to do this stuff. It's very difficult. And doing stuff like this, making these little microblades is what they're called. You really have to be good. Like, no fooling around. Like this is a skill that takes probably years to develop.
The hands were tinier though, right?
What's that?
The hands are tinier because like back then humans were quite small, so make it easier.
Well, that's the thing. Earlier hominids were quite small, but if you look at humans, if you look at Homo sapiens, they were just as tall as we are today. And I think I'll probably say this a little bit later, but when you think about hunter-gatherers, so if you go back thousands of years ago, you should really be picturing Olympic athletes. That's who these people were. Like, they were very active, they moved around a lot, they ate a diet that had a lot of different nutrients and proteins and fats, and they were super in shape. So again, if you're thinking of like humans living thousands of years ago making stone tools, don't think small people. Think like Olympic athletes. That's who you should be picturing, because that's what they were. They were in excellent physical shape, good teeth, good muscles, good bones. They're in super good shape. Yeah, so lots of different fancy tools. Here's some fish hooks that people have created, and they've woven string to go on the end of the fish hook. Here's a bunch of different ground stone tools. This is a different type of stone, like granite or so, and you can't break these and chip them into shape. You grind them into shape, and so you get maybe some animal fat, and you get some sand, and you work away at it for a long time until you shape it into an axe or an adze, or this little thing here in the middle is kind of like a spoke shave, I think. So I think it's the jawbone, the mandible of a deer, and then they've put sharpened stones in where the teeth should have been, and then you can shave wood. Have you ever seen anyone work wood like that? They've got a tool like that, and yeah, I think that's, what's that?
They use the new tools now.
Yeah, but that's the Paleolithic version of that tool, already invented. Yeah, here's a few more. So people start making all these kinds of different tools. They start making artwork, and what anthropologists suggest might have happened is that this is the point where we get a DNA mutation that actually benefits us. And what it results in is neurons in our brain that are more densely interconnected with each other, okay? And it's those interconnections that allow us to think and remember the way that we're able to do, okay? Other animals can't think like us in part because they don't have quite as many neurons as we do, but they're not interconnected in the same way, and they don't send signals in quite the same way either. And so that's kind of what gives us a real edge above any other animal on the planet and above our Neanderthal cousins, because our Neanderthal cousins didn't get this gene mutation. And so they were definitely, at the time, they were definitely the smartest animals on the planet, but they weren't as smart as we are now. And so, you know, if we could bring a Neanderthal back, if we could sort of transport them from 50,000 years ago and put them in this classroom and somehow talk with them, you would find that they weren't, by human standards, not that smart, right? By animal standards, hugely smart, right? They're smarter than any other animal around, but by our modern standards, they'd be kind of dummies. you'd be like, okay, Neanderthal. What's that?
But there are workers.
Definitely, absolutely, and successful as a successful species from probably about 700,000 years ago to about 40,000 years ago.
So, Mike,
Yeah.
let's say, for example, 700,000 years ago, what if we weren't apes, we're actually human,
Mm-hmm.
but because like no one knew about like cutting their hair or shaving their beard,
Sure.
what if like their facial hair was too long, they looked like apes?
Well, that's the thing. We don't really know what people would have looked like and what they would have done with their hair or their beards. Like, we have no idea. They would have grown beards. Neanderthals, again, would have looked like, maybe would have looked like the picture I showed you. Humans at that point, maybe 50 or 60,000 years ago, would have looked roughly like us, right? Except in much better shape. But they would have looked roughly like us. But yeah, we don't really know what they would have looked like or what they would have done with their beard. They certainly had the tools to trim, right? Like if their beard got too long, they could just they could cut it back if they wanted. They could shave if they wanted to, although I doubt they did. Who would want to? I don't miss shaving. But yeah, we don't. Those are the kinds of things we don't know for sure, right? How they would have appeared, because that stuff doesn't preserve, right? But we did get this genetic mutation, and so that kind of gave us a little bit of a boost in terms of our intelligence and our brain power. And so at that point, around 70,000 years ago, humans were humans in every sense of how you and I are, right? So they had the same intellectual capacity, they had the same kinds of feelings and emotions and desires and things like that. They were us, right? They were us just living in a technologically simple world, right? But they were us. They're just like us. I'll say this one more thing and then I'll give you a break here. One of the things that anthropologists suggest was very useful about this new brain mutation was that it allowed us to store more social information, right? And so I said one of the things that humans do very well is that we cooperate flexibly in large numbers. And part of our ability to do that is our ability to store a lot of social information, right? How many people do you think you've met in your life that you can remember? Probably quite a few, right? Far more than any animal can, right? Animals can't keep track of that. It's too much. Too many individuals, too much information, right? But humans are very good at not only remembering that social information, but our brains kind of like it, right? And I would argue that a lot of the things that we watch, say on television or movies or books that we read, really what we're interested in is people, right? And social relationships and how those people interact with each other. Human brains are very interested in that sort of information, right? Gossip, right? Talking about who's dating who or who said what to who. Humans love that too, don't we? Yeah, right? There's an entire gossip industry like Entertainment Tonight and People Magazine and all those kinds of things, that people are interested in that kind of information. So we have a brain that's wired to do a lot of things well, but I think one of the things it does well is process and store information about other people, right? And again, that's useful. It helps us cooperate when you understand other people and you know who you can trust and who you can't, right? Yeah, so storing social information is a very useful thing for a cooperative animal to do. And because we have a brain that stores and processes social information better, that might have given us an advantage, right? That might have given us an edge in the battle for survival or in the evolutionary, contest or whatever. Okay, you want to take a little break? Me too. Take a little break, come back, and then we'll talk about something else. I forget what's next, but we'll do it. it was probably it probably was, to be honest. Probably was. Yeah. Okay, ready? Ready, ready, ready? Okay, so to continue our story here, I said that our species, Homo sapiens, we evolve in Africa like many other species before us, but of course we leave Africa, right? Eventually, some of us stay behind, of course, but some of us leave and start to settle throughout the world, right? And so that happens maybe around 60,000 years ago. Humans start to leave Africa, and as I showed you before, they start to move into other parts of the world, right?
So the whole world was connected?
Basically what you see here, so Africa and Asia and Europe, those are connected. Australia and New Guinea are not connected. And North America and Asia, so by Russia up there, they're only connected for a certain window of time.
Once upon a time, it is all connected, right?
Yeah, so like, I don't even know how many millions of years ago, tens or hundreds of millions of years ago, yes, all the continents were bunched up, but they've drifted apart. But at this point in the story, you know, in a 5 million year time span, the continents don't move enough to make a difference. But sea levels rising and falling, that does make a difference. So yeah, so humans are able to sort of move out and kind of colonize, if you will, the entire world. But I mentioned, of course, there are other human species floating around, right? There's us. There's our Neanderthal cousins who are kind of living in Europe. In Europe at this point. There are these other Neanderthal-like species called Denisovans who are kind of living in Middle Asia here, who we didn't talk about. And then there's still Homo erectus, who we didn't talk about either. There's still some Homo erectuses living out in Eastern Asia and Southeast Asia. So there's potentially maybe 3 other human species living on the planet when our species starts to migrate out. And so, of course, the question is, the question is, where do they go, right? Why they were here, now they're gone. What happened to them, right? And there's basically 2 theories, okay? And the first theory is this: interbreeding, right? That we're all genetically similar enough that humans migrated out. We encountered Neanderthals, for instance. You know, they got friendly with each other and interbred. And eventually, you know, instead of 2 groups, we have 1 group, right? The second one is replacement. And so the idea here is that, yes, we leave Africa, but over time we either outcompete, so we're better at getting food, or we simply kill off the other human species, leaving only ourselves. So my question to you then is, which one do you think it is? Both?
Killing other people seems like a very human thing.
Sadly, it's true, right? Killing other humans or things that even maybe are not quite human seems to be a very human thing to do, right? Unfortunately.
But if we can say, if we say like they have no brain or not the same smart level as we are, I think that you do for them would think that this is dangerous and will defend themselves and might be like killing
Sure,
as animals do.
sure.
For marriage, they kill each other.
Yeah, we very easily could have gotten into conflict with these other humans that were different from us.
Or they were scared enough to not face each other.
True. What's that?
They fight for a girl.
Maybe, right? Maybe it was a love triangle, you know, kind of thing. Maybe it was, yeah, who knows, right? But I ask you the question, but in all honesty, we really don't know the answer to this, right? We do have some evidence, right? There are genes that are shared between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, right? We know that, that's a fact. And again, that could be interbreeding. It also could be the fact that we are very closely related. We have the same common ancestors. So the species before us, which is Homo heidelbergensis that we didn't talk about, Homo heidelbergensis eventually gives rise to both Neanderthals and us. So if you have the same parent, so imagine if you have brothers or sisters, if you have the same parents, does it make sense that you would share some genes with your brother or sister? Yeah, of course, right? Of course you do, because you have the same parents. And so Neanderthals and humans, Homo sapiens, we have the same parent species. So does it make sense that we have some similar genes? Yeah, of course it does, right? So we could have interbred, but we also come from the same original species, so we're not sure. In terms of the violence and the killing, currently we have no evidence of that, right? It doesn't mean it didn't happen, but we have no, Neanderthal skulls with, a Homo sapien spear stuck in it or something like that. We don't have any evidence of that. Again, it doesn't mean that it didn't happen, but there's no evidence to suggest that that was the case. But either way, we still don't know. We still don't know what happened. Probably all of those things happened, right? There could have been some violence. There could have been some interbreeding. There could have been some out-competing. Other species might have fled from us because they were frightened, or maybe we just frightened them off because we were smart enough to do so. Who knows, right? But either way, as of about 30,000 years, we are the only ones left, the last ones standing. Which again, it was a weird thing because up until now, there have been all kinds of different hominids running around the planet, and it's kind of strange now that we're the only ones, even though we're very used to it, right? Right. So in the process of this whole story, this 5 million year story, it's pretty interesting that our species and the species that came before us, they were able to use their brains, they were able to use their bipedal adaptation, the fact that they walk on 2 feet. There's a whole other thing I could get into about our ability to run, but I don't have time to do it, but it's very interesting. And our ability to make and use tools, and we use that to kind of move our way up the food chain, if you will. Our earliest ancestors, those Homo habilis and things that came before, they were very much in the middle of the food chain. They ate other things, but they also got eaten quite a bit by other large predators, right? But now we've kind of placed ourselves at the top of the food chain. And so as long as we don't wander off into the forest, we're not going to get eaten, right? We eat everything else and are kind of the masters of the planet, if you will. And probably the most important thing is, and this ties into culture, the idea that we evolve, our ancestors evolved from creatures that use biological adaptations to solve environmental challenges, and we've become animals that use learned behavior to answer those challenges, right? So if you imagine outside here in Vancouver, well, let's imagine we're all living thousands of years ago. Suddenly, if it gets really cold here, and I don't mean like a snowstorm, I mean like the climate changes, what's going to happen to a lot of the animals that live here? They're going to die, right? Yeah, because or they'll have to move, but if they can't move, they're going to die, right? Because they rely on their bodies and their genes to adapt them to the environment. And they can't evolve that quickly, right? But humans, if it gets really cold here tomorrow, humans don't have to wait to evolve, right? Humans can use their brains and say, okay, I guess we're going to have to sew some warmer clothing, right? We're going to stuff feathers and fur in our clothing to keep ourselves warm. And we're going to have to put an extra layer of insulation on our house, and we're going to have to build some sort of fire inside, and we're going to have to do all these different things. And so while animals are kind of stuck waiting for their genes to catch up to the environment, humans can respond like that, right? Any change in the environment, changes in food availability, humans adapt almost immediately, right? Because our adaptation, our big adaptation, is not biological or genetic, it's culture, right? It's learned behavior, and we can learn to do new things far more quickly than animals can evolve, right? And that's our big advantage, and it's what's allowed us to kind of exist in all kinds of different environments and different situations through time because we're so adaptable. And we're not genetically adaptable. We're adaptable in terms of our behavior, right? Our learned behavior, and that's the edge, right? That's what we have over other animals, is that we can change what we do and use our technology to adapt to anything that comes our way. Animals, not so much, right? They've got to rely on their genes to adapt them. And if their genes don't adapt them to the environment, then they go extinct, right? Okay, good so far? Good? Okay, so switch gears now a little bit to something different. Good. 25, okay, I've got time. One of the things we want to study in this class is, as an aspect of culture, is the subsistence practices of cultures that we study. Do you know what subsistence means, or to subsist? Not quite. What was that? To acknowledge. Oh, okay. I think those are slightly different roots. I think those words are slightly different roots. But in this context, in an anthropological context, to subsist is like to live, to survive. And when we talk about it here, what we're talking about is how people acquire their food. Okay, the method by which they get their food and their resources. And this is pretty important, right? Because yes, cultures have beliefs and values and all kinds of things going on, but people have to eat, right? Like ground level survival, people have to eat. Before all of that other stuff, we need to feed ourselves, right? And as a result, because that's so important, basically other pieces of culture are built on top of it. So your subsistence strategy is kind of a foundation for how your culture develops, right? How you get your food is critically important. All other pieces of culture rest on top of this. So whether you're talking about religion or marriage patterns, how labor and resources are divided in society, your political system, all of these things follow from your subsistence strategy, okay, from how you get your food. And when I talk about how people get their food, I'm talking about this, and there's basically five ways, 5 categories. The first one, which we've talked about just a little bit already, is hunting and gathering. So that's people who do not farm. They don't farm anything. They don't grow their own food. They don't keep animals in terms of like goats or pigs or chickens or things like that. They subsist entirely from the natural world. So they go out and they find the food that grows naturally. And so depending on where in the world you live, you could be foraging for insects or nuts or seeds or berries or flowers or honey or roots or vegetables or fruits. And you could be hunting for things like, well, anything, any animal you could hunt. People might hunt, they might fish, they might collect shellfish and clams and things like that. All kinds of things can be harvested from the natural world, and foragers or hunter-gatherers do just that. They eat what they can find in nature, and depending on where you live, those can be different things. The second one is horticulture or Swidden agriculture, and this is just very simple farming. So often people just have a little plot behind their house, they grow their own food behind their house, and they use very simple tools to do it, and they kind of just grow enough to feed their family. It's a very, very simple farming operation. Sometimes they might keep some animals as well, chickens or things like that. Pastoralists are people who survive on the domestication of animals. And so people will have herds of animals like sometimes cows, depending on where you live, sometimes sheep, sometimes pigs, sometimes goats, sometimes camels, sometimes reindeer, depending on where you live. So people keep herds of animals, and that's how they get most of their food, from the animals. Intensive agriculture is large-scale farming, and so bigger farms and people who are using some technology to farm as well. So pesticides or fertilizers or canals and things that feed their crops. All of those things are intensive agriculture. And then the last one is mechanized agriculture, and that's probably the one that we're familiar with in the modern world. So that's big, big farms using lots of technology, right? So big tractors and combines, GMOs, genetically modified organisms, chemical pesticides, chemical fertilizers, big fancy irrigation systems. All of those things are mechanized agriculture, and that's probably what we're more familiar with today. Okay, so there's kind of 5 ways that humans can get their food. And as you might imagine, the way that you get food is pretty important to your way of life, right? It's a totally different experience hunting and gathering as compared to going to Save On Foods, right? That's a different thing. So there's kind of 5 ways of obtaining food. And we'll start with our friends hunter-gatherers. And we'll start with them because this is basically our default mode of operation. So humans were hunter-gatherers for really most of their history. And so I have 200,000 years here. It should probably read 300,000 years at this point. I haven't changed it yet. But for almost all of our history, we were hunters and gatherers. This whole farming thing, that's a very recent innovation for humans. So our kind of default setting, our physiology, the way our body works, is all based on hunter-gatherers and their activity patterns and their diets, right? So again, hunter-gatherers are gathering things from the natural world. And basically, hunter-gatherers, human hunter-gatherers, have eaten basically everything that's not poisonous or won't kill us. So anything you can imagine, again, berries, roots, seeds, nuts, insects, things in shells, right? Mollusks, clams, lobsters, crabs, any animal on the land, any animal in the sea, snakes, rats, bats, whatever. Humans have eaten them at one time or another, right? Despite the fact, of course, that sometimes we have rules about what should or shouldn't be eaten. Humans have basically eaten everything in the course of our history, right? Now, the earliest foragers that were around, so let's think, we said that at about 30,000 years there was just us left on the planet. There were no other human species. But if you go back to that time, or if you try to imagine what that was like, it's very difficult to know, okay? So it's important to know that there's no writing from this period. Writing is a very recent innovation as well. It's probably about 6,000 or 7,000 years old at the oldest. So 30,000 years ago, nobody's writing anything down. There's also not a lot in terms of archaeological evidence because hunter-gatherers don't own a lot of stuff. They move around quite a bit, maybe as much as 10 kilometers a day, looking for food. And so if you had to walk 10 kilometers a day and you had to carry everything you own with you, would you own a lot of things? No, that'd be crazy, right? You can't walk 10 kilometers with this giant pack of stuff, right? And similarly, hunter-gatherers don't really own anything. They have their clothing that they need. They have the tools that they need to survive, some knives and maybe some hunting implements of some type. But that's kind of, for the most part, that's it. They don't own a lot of stuff. And so if you don't own a lot of stuff, you often don't leave a lot of stuff behind. And if you don't leave a lot of stuff behind, there's not much for archaeologists to find. And so hunter-gatherers are very difficult to detect in the archaeological record because they don't leave a lot of junk. Farmers are much better because they stay in one place for a long time and they keep piling their garbage in a garbage pit for years and years and years. And so they're much easier to study that way. Hunter-gatherers don't do that. There's a few people that still make their living this way. There's still a few hunter-gatherers that live on planet Earth. But again, we have some research that studied those people, but they are, they're not stuck in the past, right? So they've been connected to the modern world. They know what things are like. They've traded for things like clothing, and we'll meet some hunter-gatherers very shortly who have done this. And so we can't really study them as if they were totally isolated from the modern world, because they're not entirely, right? So they're not a good comparison for what people's hunter-gatherer life would have been like thousands of years ago. One thing we should remember about hunter-gatherers is that they use their food resources in a way that's extensive and temporary, okay? So what this means is that hunter-gatherers move around a lot, right? Like I said, maybe 10 kilometers a day. And so when they come to a place and sort of maybe make their tents, they put their tents up or their shelters up for a couple days, they kind of just look around and eat whatever is there, right? So they might try to hunt some things, and maybe they get a couple of rabbits, maybe there's a duck they are able to catch, maybe there's some mushrooms growing here, and maybe some berries, right? And so that's what they'll eat. They'll just eat whatever is kind of there and easily available. And after a few days, they'll leave, right? And so they don't kind of strip a particular area of food. They just kind of go, they find or catch what's easily findable or catchable, and then they move on, right? And they go to the next place and they find whatever's there, right? And so in the process of this, they move a lot, but moving a lot allows them to easily find food. Because the longer, I think we can kind of guess this, but the longer you stay in one place, probably the less food is going to be available, right? Because nature doesn't replenish itself immediately, right? So if you stay in one place and you eat a bunch of mushrooms, then there's no mushrooms anymore, right? And you've got to either look for something else or you've got to walk further to find more mushrooms. So the hunter-gatherers kind of make their lives easy by moving around. And the more they move, the more they can find food easily. And so that's kind of what they do. Most hunter-gatherers live in really small groups, so maybe 30 to 50 people. And so those people, if you can imagine yourself living in a hunter-gatherer group 20,000 years ago, you'd probably live most of your life with those people. And you probably wouldn't encounter many other people in your entire life. So that community of 30 or 50 people would be your family, right? You'd know them very, very well. And again, you probably wouldn't meet that many other people in your entire life, right? Here, of course, in a modern city, we're walking around and there's thousands of people that we walk by every day and sit on the SkyTrain with and so on and so forth. But at this point in time, there's not that many people. And in fact, there might have been only 5 to 8 million people on the entire planet at this point. So think about what that looks like. How many people live in the lower mainland here? Do you know? Yeah, it's about I think it's about 2.4 or something, depending on what cities you kind of include. Yeah, there's about 2.4 million people living in the lower mainland here. So double that. That's the number of people that live on the entire planet at this point. Huh?
They must have been so rich.
Yeah. Well, because everything, like nature was pristine, right? There was 5 million people on the entire planet. There was no cities, there was no towns, there was no pollution, and You just had nature, right? So people actually lived a really good, for the most part, they lived a great existence. There was lots of food available for them. They moved around a lot. They could kind of choose where to live for the most part. And so this hunter-gathering thing, you know, I think it picked up a bit of a negative connotation. Like some people thought it was a really difficult way to make a living, but actually it's pretty good. Anthropologists estimate that most hunter-gatherers, they work about 18 hours a week. So it takes them about 18 hours a week to get all of the things that they need to survive. And outside of that, do whatever you want. Play a game, chat with your friend, take a nap, whatever. Do whatever you want. So, you know, here, you know, we're working a 40-hour work week here in the West, and some countries more. But hunter-gatherers were, you know, putting in 15 to 18 hours a week, and they had everything they needed. And they were as near as we can tell, they were healthy and happy and well-fed and had good nutrition, and it's not a bad gig, right? People lived in small groups so that they didn't surpass the carrying capacity of the environment. Have you ever heard that before, the carrying capacity? Maybe in bio?
How much an environment can like sustain how many creatures until the resources run out?
Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of the level of the population of organisms, of creatures, that an environment can support before the resources are gone, right? So humans tried to sort of keep their populations low and small because they didn't want to have more people than the environment could support, right? And so nature only grows so much food, right? There's only so many rabbits in the forest, and if you have too many people, your resources are going to run out and you're going to go hungry, right? So people actually stayed in small groups, and they tried to limit their populations as well. They tried not to have their groups grow too big so that they could stay below the carrying capacity of the land. Again, people moved around a lot. There's no cities, there's no towns, there's no villages, right? For the most part, people are staying in very temporary camps. They have tents or temporary shelters that they use. And people were living in all kinds of environments that were very, very rich, right? That had lots of food resources. And actually, the place we're living in now was a place where actually it was super rich in terms of resources. Lots of animals, lots of fish, shellfish, berries, nuts, seeds, all kinds of things. So this was an area of the world where there was actually a lot of food available to people. But we'll get to that a little bit later. The other thing we should remember about these people, about hunter-gatherers, is that they are experts at their environment, okay? So you and I, you know, we'd probably go off into the forest and like die in 4 days because we don't know how to do anything, right? We don't know how to build shelters. We don't know how to find food. We'd probably be eaten by a bear. We're clueless, right? We don't know how to exist in that environment. But these guys are experts, right? They have grown up in nature. They know every plant, every animal. They know how to find food. They know how to start fires with nothing. They know how to build their own, but they know how to find that stuff and do it. They know how to, what's that?
It's easy to make fire. You just get like something that's easy to burn, and then you get like 2 rocks and start hitting it on it. When like the sparks come on the wall or something, it gets burned directly.
Yeah.
You just blow into it and put it in the wood.
If you have the right rock.
Any smooth rock works.
Yeah. Yeah, so, but there you go. But people know how to do that stuff, right? They know how to make their own clothing. They know how to make their own tools. They know where to find the materials to make their own tools, right? They know how to hunt and fish and trap. They know how to predict the weather. They know what foods are poisonous. They know what foods are available at certain times of year.
Trees and the way how to go and come back.
Yeah, they can find their way through the landscape with no map, no compass, right? They know where they are, like they're living in their own house.
Google Maps.
Yeah.
You
They're-
say, oh, I've seen this tree before. If I go to the forest, I see the tree like at the same time, at the same minute, 10 times I won't remember it.
Yeah, exactly, right? But they will, right? And so they're,
They probably had marks on them.
what's that?
They had marks.
Sure, absolutely. Absolutely they did. But what I'm trying to drive home is that this is a way of life that is highly skilled, right? So being a hunter-gatherer it's not a ton of work, right? It's not a hard way of life, but you really need to know what you're doing, right? There is a lot of skills to learn. And if you don't learn them, you're gonna die. Yeah, because you need to know how to survive out there, because you don't, all you have is nature, right? And you need to know how to do these things. But again, they did. They were experts. Again, this is the last thing I'll say. Again, they were in superb physical shape. These are people who were outside all the time. They were active. They were exercising. They got lots of sleep. They ate a wide variety of foods, so they got lots of different nutrients. And yeah, like you should imagine Olympic athletes, big, tall, strong Olympic athletes, because that's who these people were. Really good physical specimens, if you will.
They said like ancient people before, they were like huge. They weren't like our normal population now.
Well, they probably wouldn't have been, they wouldn't have been taller than humans get, right? Like even in modern times with great nutrition, humans don't tend to get too much taller than about 6 feet, right? Like there's some of us who are taller than that, but but hunter-gatherers were, they got to 6 feet and maybe a little bit over. So they were, yeah, they're big, healthy people, absolutely. But we're kind of out of time, so I'll end it there. We'll talk a little bit more about hunting and gathering tomorrow, and then a little bit about farming. Have a great afternoon. I will see you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
Yeah.